Okay, people are seeing. I'm just about ready. Okay, I got it too.
Sweet.
All right, great.
Awesome.
We're ready.
All right. Thanks for inviting me to speak. So I'm going to talk about NumFOCUS, which is a foundation for sustaining open source scientific software tools. Something I think XSEDE knows quite a bit about, since you guys have so many of them. I worked, so just kind of who I am, my name's Andy Terrel. I'm currently the chief scientist at a company called Continuum Analytics. We work on Python data science tools. In my previous life, I was a researcher at the Texas Advanced Computing Center, so TAC, there at UT Austin. And so I've been an XSEDE employee in the past, and helped many fine scientists use y'all's wonderful systems. So I just kind of want to get, so Marlon asked me to talk about NumFOCUS, so I'm going to talk about who we are. So also I'm the current president of the board at NumFOCUS, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about why, who we are, why we exist, what we do, how you can help, and feel free to interrupt me during my presentation. I have kind of the whole deck here, but I'm always happy to take questions. So first, let's just ask why we exist. So the first question, so I'm going to go off the assumption that has been established that scientific advance is pretty closely linked to software these days. Software is pretty much in every part of the scientific workflow and the scientific discovery. But one thing that is not always questioned is what happens to that software as it's not maintained. And my claim is just like a house, your software has to be maintained the same way. You have to have people who use it, who maintain it, who keep it up to date, keep the educational materials up to date. It's not enough just to build software and release it to the wild. Almost no software survives after many years of bit rot in that capacity. Even pieces of software that we traditionally think of as being something someone built a long time ago and is done. For example, with laws, actually no, there's a very large community that has been supporting it for many years. So then the next question I ask is, well, as the software decays and it's often not maintained, then what also happens to the scientific software developer? And the analogy I'll give is from Philip P. Bourne, who's now the director of the NIH. He gave this at the WSPI, the Workshop on Sustaining Scientific Software Practice and Experience. And his experience was that half of his lab now gets on the Google bus. His viewpoint was people who can actually write scientific software are being recruited heavily by companies that need our skill sets, and to the point of the detriment in his lab where he could no longer support the people who wrote the software to make his scientific advances happen. So if science needs software and software needs developers, well, where do we put the developers? There's been many answers to this question. There's a lot of folks who work in government labs, such as the Department of Energy and the DoD labs. They certainly are a huge supporter of scientific software. And I think the majority of the scientific software most scientists use goes through one of these big labs these days. The second place we find a lot of people is in places like this telescope here, where there's a huge instrument, or something needs some big science experiment that has to be supported. For example, NASA is a great example, where in order to even do the science, you have to have software developers to run the instruments and do the analysis and so on and so forth. Another example is, for example, the XSEDE centers and HPC centers. When I was at TAC, we employed, I think, on the order of 15 scientific software folks who came from different aspects of the scientific discipline, from astronomers to chemists to biologists, and then a few computer scientists and mathematicians like me. And then there's kind of this last category that's probably the most at stake, which is pretty large and rapidly growing, is this temporary workforce in academia we like to call the postdoc, who is famously underpaid and the butt of many jokes on the PhD comics, which is always a fun read if you haven't seen it. It's highly recommended. So why doesn't this just work? So what is failing in this process? So the first, I'm going to give three basic kind of examples, and I'll go through a case with one of our projects. The first is the legal structures between the different organizations make it very difficult to collaborate. So if you have one project that starts in the DOE and has varying degrees of funding based upon whether classifications of either the use case or the secrecy of what you're doing, when they try to interact with universities who have a different set of criteria, such as publishing papers and teaching students, and furthermore, like in service organizations like TAC was, where your main focus is making sure your machines are up and running and usable by other folks. There's not really a single entity that is actually caring about the software, and you kind of have to shuffle it in between each one of these, and none of them have the legal structure set up to support software developers in the way that you would at a company, per se. The second is, as we've all seen, academic funding is getting tighter. We can go back and forth whether there's really a reduction in the amount of funds available or whatnot, or if it just goes to more program managers and things like that, or administrative roles. But I think everybody agrees that it's much harder to get grants today than it was 30 years ago. But on the flip side, salaries and companies are growing, so this creates kind of that third category of like the constant flow of scientific software writers who are often leaving the community. I think of the people when I graduated back in about 5 or 6 years ago, I know only 3 folks that I worked with on 3 or 4 major projects that are actually still in academia. I think, or even in the government lab space, because even the government labs are losing people pretty rapidly. So of all these reasons, things are kind of not working very well for many scientific software developers. So let me give you an example of a project that I hold near and dear to the heart because I use their software every day, the IPython project. I think at this point they're well enough known that they kind of get around. But just to give you an example, here's an excerpt from Nature on the Scientists Digital Toolbox, and so they have a collaborative environment for sharing analysis and code and together in a story, so that scientists can share their findings and the code that got to those findings very quickly. IPython Notebook has been ported to many different systems. I've seen them used in many different companies. I've seen them used on supercomputers and in labs, in pretty much every part of the scientific ecosystem, and now even to teach classes and host papers on Nature. But the IPython team is not while you probably heard Fernando or Brian get up and speak about it, they're not a central organization. They're separate on 2 continents, 4 academic institutions, and several companies that all contribute to this project. And if they go through the normal channels of academic funding, the project's probably going to see around 30% of that money, if they can even work it out. So usually, if you enter that 501c3, you can't really you can't give money to a company. Or if you give, or companies often don't want to give money straight to a lab. I think, for example, Fernando's now at the Lawrence Berkeley lab. So even if the channel's worked out, there's huge penalties to get this money to them, because these institutions are built at a time when the overhead goes to much bigger, like for example, if you're going to an instrument, there's a lot of overhead to support that instrument, and the software isn't seen as as a critical piece. And finally, the last kind of piece that's just dear to my heart is that if they're bound to the university pay structure, they're probably not going to be able to keep their talent. And as I've kind of stated before, it's that even the talent pool that is coming, all the software that goes into building something like the IPython is pretty intense. From the kind of the talent of like doing massive JavaScript libraries to linking to very complex low-level libraries and managing code between those different projects. So all those things together make it very difficult for projects to get money and function as a project in this space. So when our institutions fail us, often foundations kind of pick up the slack and start to create new ones. I think a great example of this is the reason our roads have stripes on them is because of I think a foundation one of the Rockefellers built up for safety on the roads. So foundations have often served this purpose of finding places where there's gaps in our society, finding money and places to help improve that and move forward. And that's what NumFOCUS is trying to do. So who are we? First off, we consist of over 20 different projects at this point. We got started in the Python world, but we've expanded to R and Julia supported projects. But at the same time, like most of the Python projects, a lot of the code is written in C, C++, Fortran, and yes, even JavaScript. But the core part of this is these are kind of the latest generation of tools that are highly focused on usability of these tools for scientists. And we even have some educational projects such as software carpentry and data carpentry that are there to help scientists learn how to use tools in a better way so that as developers like to use them. Second, the people who kind of help us get started. You might recognize some of the names, some of the faces here, but we have 9 board members. The original founding members consisted of 5 members of the scientific Python community. We cross the boundaries of government labs, industry, and academic institutions. We have tenured professors, assistant professors, postdocs, developers at companies, and even graduate students in our cadre of folks, and a CEO, a couple of CEOs of companies. We really are trying to cast a wide net to bring together people who've all experienced this problem and try to bring their heads together to solve it. And finally, where do we get our money from? Right now, most of our money has come from corporate donations. It's a little bit surprising at first, but when you start to work with a lot of corporations, they're using scientific tools more and more, especially as data science is becoming such a critical tool for the landscape of companies today. We're trying to work more with foundations, for example, the Sloan Foundation, and their interest is the same, some of the interests that even academics have, like producing reproducible pieces of reproducible science. And as we've seen, an uptick in paper rejections, or I guess not rejections, but callbacks on papers because of the results being incorrect. They want to respond to that crisis, and one way is to support the software that works experiments. Okay, that's the problem we're trying to solve. That's who we are. I'd like to go a little bit through how we do this right now, and kind of where people could jump in if they ever thought they wanted to help solve these problems. The first thing is we support software projects. We started with our projects. The projects are the ones that we're here to serve. We're not as big as there's other foundations that serve a lot more projects. For example, the Apache Foundation. Right now we have a core set of 20. and we try to make sure that we take in projects that are established enough that they have a user base and kind of prove themselves to be a usable tool by the community, but also without trying to overburden the volunteer staff that we have. So first off, is supporting the projects in order that they need.
Hey, Andy, let me interrupt just for a second. So, if everybody else could mute, please. Yeah, somebody else needs to mute. Okay, if you have questions, please feel free to unmute and ask, but please be on mute while Andy's giving the presentation. You could also send a note on the chat window. Thanks. Okay, go ahead, Andy.
All right, cool. Just as I can't see the chat window, so maybe Marlon, if there's a chat window, you could stop me.
Yep, I'll do that.
All right, cool. So basically, we support the software projects, and there's a mechanism for they express their needs. For example, testing, doing build and tests is a common need, or even hiring developers if we have the funds and so on and so forth. And then also, if you wanted to give directly to a project, we have a page of donation buttons to give directly to that project, so that if you really want to see that the code actually succeed and live on, we do give individuals an opportunity to participate in that experiment. So the second big thing we've been doing is funding training for software, for scientific software training. This picture of John Hunter, who is the developer of Matplotlib, one of the kind of premier plotting libraries in the scientific Python ecosystem, and he passed away, and so we have funds dedicated, this fellowship dedicated to him, of trying to teach graduate students who are their scientific studies are very highly tied to also building good software, and so we've had one student go through, Ola Bodbenik, and I've forgotten where I think she's San Diego. But anyway, so that's another place that we're kind of trying to push more money so that it is okay for students to actually work on software instead of only on papers during their PhD. Another thing we get asked a lot is to help encourage underrepresented groups. It's well established that women and minorities are not as represented in open source software. So to encourage and to build a better pipeline for these groups, we have, for example, women boot camps, trainings. We have dedicated money to send women and minorities to conferences and so on, just to help kind of increase diversity throughout the community. I think it's a problem that a lot of science has. In particular, scientific software is kind of the intersection of two challenging, as far as diversity is challenged in both software the world and many of the hard science world. So scientific software is often even worse than either one taken separately. And then the thing that takes probably our most time, and I would say is probably the thing that drives a lot of our community, is we help host events such as conferences, hackathons, and meetups. And here's an example of a conference that we help support called PyData. That's kind of spawned its own life, and we help organizations all over the world at this point. Well, I guess just Europe and the U.S. and South America host conferences on Python and different data applications. For example, here's a picture of Gaël Varco in France, who does neuroscience. And so we also have lots of things like hackathons for scikit-learn and help different organizations whenever they need funding to focus on an intense part of their sprint or parts of their roadmap and things like that. So that's more or less all what we're doing these days, and we're constantly kind of growing and trying to build our those activities as we go forward. So how people can help, So right now we have memberships, we have like all our donation pages to donate to different projects and so on. We're constantly looking to encourage corporate and foundation sponsorship. There's a lot of people who need this scientific software to become better as throughout all of the service it does for the world. And so we try to partner with a lot of these organizations. And then we have mailing lists and committees that people can join if they're more interested in doing things. And so that's who NumFOCUS is. That's what we do. Question? Comment?
Yeah, do we have any questions out there?
I think it's great that there is a foundation like yours that exists. I was actually wondering about your own funding. So you get corporate sponsorship to support some of the projects and the outreaches. What about your own organization's funding?
Yeah, so what we do at this point is we take a very modest fee for anything that we raise. It's 7% that comes back to, and that funds our executive director. And we have our conferences actually generate a little bit of also part of so you do pay for the conference, and if the conference makes money, it comes back to our general fund. And we're also seeking grants specifically for so for right now we have different grants to get. For example, a developer that we can share building and doing development, and also like fundraising folks, like someone to do fundraising and things like that. And so yeah, we're kind of trying to work out. I mean, our first kind of goal was, so we're only, I guess, and it says we're only 3 years old. We started at the SciPy conference when we were sitting around thinking, how are we going to, like, with all the people that we knew, like, leaving grad school and postdocs, and it was like, how are we going to keep funding what we're doing? And the first goal was just to get money flowing to the projects, and now we're kind of looking at how do we fund more systematically everything we're doing. So, yeah.
So, Andy, on the donations page, how do you handle those donations? So I want to, let's say I click, I want to donate to SciPy or IPython or something. Where does the money go after I make that donation?
So what happens is that, so you make a donation and you say, I want to go to IPython, for example. And so there you click on the button, it takes you to a PayPal page, and it's tagged in IPython. And then we have so our accountant will then put that into our account bucket for IPython projects. And then the IPython project will then make requests for money. So each project has its own fiscal team, and they will then get knowledge of like what they have, and they'll make requests to do like sprints or other things to do with the money, or like travel and so on and so forth. And that way, there's kind of this system where, since we're a 501c3, all the things we have to do, everything we have to do is for the public good. So if they come and they ask for money to, for example, support a political candidate, we would have to deny that. But they make a request for the money, and then once they do it, we reimburse them. So 7% goes to the general fund, and then everything else goes directly to whatever need the project has through the project's fiscal team, which is a panel of 3 to 5 people of their choosing.
Yeah, Andy, this is, go ahead, Kenneth.
Oh, okay. I was just wondering if the foundation influences technical direction of the projects, or is it more generally financial support?
So generally we don't, we have separated it out intentionally not to have technical direction. I mean, we do, we all go to conferences together, and we all go to, so we have lots of discussions. But so, in practice, since we all know each other, often it's the case that like here's funding available to like things like the Women in Technology was a case where we can get, I can say, here's a funding opportunity, and so that those move the projects around, but we try not to have, we try to give the project their own, like they have their own technical, however they do their governance of their project to determine their technical direction. So even more so, since we are a 501c3, no organization. So for example, Microsoft can't come to us and say, hey, we want IPython to build better on Chinese Windows, for example. And because that would be a pass-through. Basically, a organization coming to us to say we want this and we're good money for that, and that's not what we're here for. It is the case that what often will happen is that people publish their roadmap, and they'll say, for example, IPython wants to split apart and add different backends to its system, and then as they talk about this, whenever someone says, "Hey, I'd like to support that," they then route them to us to handle the donations and whatnot. So typically, the way the technical directions happen is it has to first come from the project itself, and then money can be passed to us to then support those efforts.
Nancy, I think you had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Marlon. Thanks, Andy, for a terrific talk. This is Nancy Wilkins here at SDSC. It was very, very well done. I think most of the people on the call are software developers themselves, primarily for science gateways, but also for other things too, I'm sure. I wonder what kind of tips you have for folks on how to kind of approach their own projects so that they can overcome some of these hurdles that you laid out that I'm sure people are well familiar with, academic funding models and having to constantly find new sources of income and sustainability and all those sorts of things. I'm not sure each of us trying to set up independent 501c3s is kind of realistic, but what do you see as kind of a wider solution for the variety of projects that are going on?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I wish I had a better answer. We set up the 501c3 so that open source scientific projects don't have to. That's why we did. I think even the nature of starting up your own 501c3 is pretty difficult because of the way so early in our career, we found out the IRS just basically stopped accepting any applications that were about software. So actually our mission is to promote and sustain education around software. But to do that, you also need to support the developers who create that software. So there's even legally trying to find out, the IRS wants to support science, but they also realize this is an economically valuable activity, and so even starting a 501c3 is pretty challenging. I guess there's a couple of aspects to that. The first is to just ask what part of the software life cycle your project is in. If it is the case, I have a lot of folks who come to me and it's I wrote this code in graduate school and I have 3 or 4 users and it's just a really great project. It's yes, it's probably a really great project, and you should continue doing it, and you should definitely support it, but it's not really yet something that is going to have the massive appeal that a lot of these other projects do. So it's somewhat of a chicken and egg problem. How do you become popular enough to be supported in a massive way, and how do you work and also be able to navigate the funding scene? So one thing is just be very realistic about where your project lives. There are other organizations, for example, the Apache Foundation that has incubators, and they have a process of governance throughout their process, so that you can come in, so you have a very small code that has promise, and it can come in and live as an incubator status and still appreciate the status that the Apache Foundation gives it. Our organization itself, since we're so small, we've chosen not to kind of go down that path, although we probably in the next year we might have some way to get on board small projects. So in that kind of aspect, for small projects, it's still very difficult to get up and going. But I think the conversations nationally is happening more, and I think that software developers need to participate in that conversation. Things like the workshop on sustainable scientific software that Dan Katz and the SSI, which is the in Edinburgh, Neil Chung Hong, and several other, and like Karen Kranz. There's a lot of people kind of already participating in this national conversation. And Karen, I think you were at this. I think you presented a couple of them. So even like getting involved and making sure that people know that scientific software developers are out there, because the landscape is changing a bit, and also just making sure our funding agencies understand that if we don't have scientific software around, we're basically going to kind of choke off scientific advancement. I think another big thing that we don't do very well as scientific software developers is promote the things that have been found by our software. For example, certainly software I've written has been used by medical researchers. I've never gone down and tracked down every paper that's ever been used by software, and doing that actually will help a lot for the current mechanisms to reward your scientific output from your efforts. And so I know it's a hard thing to do and keep up with everything else you want to do, but for now that's kind of like the standard. I don't know if that completely answers your question, but it's at least a few thoughts.
No, that's a really great answer. I mean, I think in the gateways, there's quite a range. There are several gateways, people on the call now, where the users are into the thousands, so they're pretty well established, and you have a little tighter handle on who's using UN for what than you do with here, download this from GitHub, and away things go, so yeah, it makes me think about whether a 501c3 for gateways makes sense at all. But thanks for your very insightful comments. That's a good answer. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that also one thing we're toying with is trying to do more umbrella. So the IRS has like a viewpoint of like there's umbrella organizations and then there's like individual nonprofits. And one thing, if you do have a large team or like a team of people who want to have like a Gateways Foundation, one easy way to do that is to bring it under like, for example, the software conservancy it basically runs like its own foundation, and they operate under a legal status in the U.S. under us, but they kind of have their own governance and bylaws and so forth. So even like if you wanted to go down that road of trying to have a bigger foundation, joining with a foundation like NumFOCUS or Apache Foundation or Linux Foundation or Software Conservancy. So there's several of these that have kind of popped up with different flavors that you can find.
Other questions?
I have a couple of questions. When you say how many users it has, I think when Nancy said it, I think users means something different than what you mean. But let me check my understanding. I think when you say users, you mean the number of sort of open source developers who are actively engaged and contributing to the project. Is that what you mean?
No, not exactly. I mean, like, for example, NumPy is one of our founders is Travis Oliphant. He founded NumPy. NumPy has effectively 4 active developers, but it's got over 2 million users. And so how important is this piece of software to the scientific process and other projects? I think it's a hard thing to measure, but for us, it's like, well, I think a lot of companies look at it and says, if NumPy goes away, so it's very easy to make this argument. It's like, hey, NumPy only has 4 developers. What are you guys going to do if NumPy goes away? And so that like spurs action, and so that makes it so you can have that conversation about funding. And that's why we've kind of focused on things that have users and wide adoptions and say, hey, if this isn't supported, I think probably one of the challenges in, I guess, a lot of the gateways community is kind of tied very directly to the machines and the services they do. So I think as long as it's crossing multiple, like if software crosses multiple different groups and activities, then it actually becomes more of a very important to folks. So that's where the conversation comes to, like, how can we motivate people to become more interested in your software and effectively interested in making sure you exist. So if you didn't exist, they understand that how much their lives would be changed.
And do you this is really interesting, thanks. And do you then function as an intermediary soliciting support for them, or what role do you, I mean, not you, but, the organization take in advocating for them?
So we're kind of do both. For example, the IPython guys, they basically handle a lot. They go and solicit for money themselves, and then whenever they get money, they just pass it to us to manage. So very much a case where they found funders, and their funders say, how do we actually get you money? Another example is the Julia folks, and I think another thing people don't think about is, like, if somebody wanted to write a check for my software project today, how would they do it? And so we kind of often serve as that fiscal sponsorship of like, oh, you found someone who wants to write a check for your group, just send them to us, and we'll manage the account. So that's part of it. The second part is, like, because we have so many people in our group, like we go after, like, all our corporate sponsors often are wider, longer conversations, and so they have a single organization to come make that longer conversation with, and so then we actually can get funding for the general group as well. And so it kind of happens in both ways.
I see. So some people make general donations, and you can split it among your projects according to, and otherwise you can solicit for specific.
That's right.
Sure. Thanks very much. That was really interesting.
Andy, I have another question about funding. So, maybe, I don't know how much legal detail this will, or tax detail this will involve, but feel free to go into whatever level you think is appropriate. But if someone or a small group of people have some software and they have found someone who, say, wants to do some donations, they can point them to you, but what keeps them from handling it themselves? I guess, is there some tax or legal restriction about that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So first, there's pretty. I mean, we can dive down into the whole mess, right? So often, another thing that often happens, right, is, like, people often come to you and say, hey, I have a project, it's all at one university, and I get paid through the university. It's like, well, hey, I mean, the university's kind of supporting you already. Have money go through your university, right? So if it's only a single university or a single business or a single person, like, you already have legal structures set up for you, and you should use those legal structures for sure. Where it becomes really, so for example, if you're a project, like if you were the developer of NumPy and you wanted to build something out, so now a legal entity so say a corporation wants to give you money, they could contract to you, but there's often it becomes like the legal structures for them to contract you could be like a 1099 contractor, which is often what, like, folks like Linus Torvalds, the writer of Linux, does, and that's fine, but that relationship is has to go through the corporate's office, right? It can't be. They have to have some justification for that. Whereas a different office usually gives out money to to 501 nonprofits and charities, and so they typically that organization inside that most organizations the office that gives to charities can't really just give to a single individual without lots of paperwork and lots of details. So kind of if an organization, it's a further incentive to have a 501c3 that can take that money and also give back the tax credits and other kind of how regulations work inside those corporations. So certainly people can go get contracts to work on their software, and that's totally, even if they come under our umbrella as a fiscal sponsored project, we're not saying you can't ever take money from somebody else. It's because you as an individual can take money and do whatever you like. But if money wants to come through from the nonprofit side, And especially in this case where you have several universities or several institutions that need to prosper from the software, like we're often better at interacting with offices that give out that money. And so I think another aspect of it is that I may have been in organizations where you might win a small grant, but that small grant actually like is pretty small, like maybe it's $50,000, and you're an institution who's like has $100 million worth of funding a year. It's very hard to get any sort of support for that grant often. So even that, like those tensions within an organization, even going outside the organization to accept money often happens and is useful. And you see this in academia a lot, where I think this is why we have so many institutions at every academic facility these days. So to answer your question, there's a lot of reasons, and you kind of have to judge based upon what your situation is and what's appropriate for you.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? I had a couple more questions, kind of related. One was, if you have upcoming hackathons that might be of interest to the Gateway community, what's the best way to find out? And then the other one was,